All right, good evening, everyone, and so glad you could join us tonight. My name is Morgan Bradley, and I work for the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. And tonight's program is brought to you by the Central Arkansas Library System's Arkansas Animals Real and Imagined Summer Reading Club. And we would like to remind everybody that this program is being recorded and that you will be able to find it on the Central Arkansas Library System's YouTube channel later on. If anybody has any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them either throughout the program or at the end. We will have time for questions at the end as well. So with that, I will present our presenter tonight, Lauren Marshall. She's with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission out of the Witt Stevens Jr. Central Arkansas Nature Center. So she's going to be presenting about Pumped About Pollinators. So Lauren, take it away. Lauren, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. You're good to go.
Sorry guys, sometimes my default swaps and I'm never sure when or why it's going to do that. But like Morgan said, my name is Lauren Marshall. I'm one of the educators for the Witt Stevens Jr. Central Arkansas Nature Center. So I'm glad that you all could join us tonight for this presentation. This is the site that Morgan and I work out of. We are one of 5 nature centers that is here in the state of Arkansas and managed by the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. Our job is to help people at our site to create a connection with the outdoors, whether that's something like hunting or fishing, or something more non-consumptive like bird watching, or enjoying a watchable wildlife experience another way. We're really excited to partner with the Central Arkansas Library System tonight and share a little bit about pollinators and their story, not just here in Arkansas, but their importance all over. So every good story starts with some kind of once upon a time moment. And if we want to think about it, if we go back far enough, once upon a time for pollinators started, and insects in general, started back in what we would consider prehistoric times. So we think about Jurassic is one that gets thrown around a lot. There's all sorts of other periods within the prehistoric timeline that get thrown out. I don't remember all of them. My 6-year-old niece can tell you more about dinosaurs than you've ever wanted to hear in your life. But we don't often think about the insects that were there and their purpose there. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But we do know that they played some kind of role in that prehistoric time because we see fossils and we see imprints left behind. So I want y'all to think about, your favorite creature and of how it plays a role in the world today, and how, if we were to look back, what might it have looked like, or what might have been way, way back. Well, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not an ethnobotanist. I'm no expert in any of these things. I'm just someone that enjoys pollinators. I'm someone that enjoys history and nature and all of that. So we're going to focus a little bit more on some of the stories that are here in the United States, a little bit more in our history, and a little bit more of what we can do today. So I want y'all to think about, ancient civilizations. I want you to think about when people started to move to America. That wasn't that long ago. Egyptians used honey, Mesopotamia, the Roman Empire, a lot of what we would consider ancient civilizations are going to be kind of that first contact that we have with any kind of writing or any kind of hieroglyphic history of different insects, especially pollinators. Like I mentioned, when we get up into like recent history, it's hard to imagine 500 years ago being, early or like recent or anything like that. But 500 years is just a drop in the bucket when it's compared to the history of the whole world. We think about the Pilgrims and how they came to America. And this is one of those iconic pictures of them on the boat praying that they even make it to shore. Later, we have pictures of the first Thanksgiving. And then I really enjoyed this one because in the bottom left corner, it shows fruits and vegetables and commerce and all of these things. And to me, it looks a little bit more like maybe something happening at Jamestown than say like Plymouth or a colony in Massachusetts. But it's showing, any kind of progress that was made. And so we start to see, not just this ragtag bunch, but these people that have decided that they're going to stay and they're going to colonize this vast land that they know nothing about. We get so caught up in that story sometimes that we forget what was really happening in those 13 colonies and what was happening even south of there in Florida. It wasn't just the British that were settling the New World. There were French explorers that were drawn to furs. There were Spanish explorers and monks and others that had come to settle the New World, that had come to bring any kind of colony to those areas. And they had been there for several years before anyone from Britain ever landed. That's just what we learn about in our history books. If we look at any of the 13 colonies, they were all settled by different people. New York was once known as New Amsterdam, and so we can only assume that the Dutch and Swedes and more of your northern Europeans were in that area. We know that like William Penn founded Pennsylvania, so you're talking about Quakers. Georgia was founded by people that were just trying to figure out how close they could get to Florida without going into Florida and taking over that area. But the unique thing about this, if we want to look at it this way, and if we start to think of it this way, is that these people brought a lot of things with them that they weren't sure they might not, be able to live without. So you think about if you were going to settle across the country, or if you were even going to settle across the world, what are those important things that you would bring with you? And for them, there's a little bit of a twist in the tale because food is always an important part of any story. And for them, they had to be able to salt their own food to preserve it, but they also needed a sweetener to preserve it. And so you start to see what we consider like the iconic bee hive, which ironically at that time was like a woven basket. We also start to see these wooden structures where people just basically threw some old shingles or whatever bark that they had together, put a lid on it, and then put a rock on top of that to keep things from going and just digging in the middle of it all. So when we start to think about these people that came before us, these people that settled North America, if you really get into the manifests and you really get into what they were doing, you start to see more and more information about bees. And you start to see about like the trade that surrounded these hives and what a commodity it was. And so, like I mentioned before, this is something that's been going on for thousands of years, since the dawn of time and human civilization as we know it. But this is something that, links the United States to the rest of the world, and provides a continued legacy for certain peoples. During the pandemic, I was able to start some books that I wanted to start. I was also able to kind of explore into some books that had been recommended and I hadn't had time for. And one of those series that I kind of got started on and didn't get very far into was known as the Foxfire books. And the Foxfire books actually started out as like a magazine. And Elliot Wigington, I think was his name, he had college students that went out into West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, other parts of the Appalachians, and they started interviewing all these old timers. And they were just enthralled by this way of life that has survived in the Appalachians for so long. And one of the things that they discovered were the people that kept bees. And you think about the landscape there. It's very wooded. It's very rocky. You might not consider it hospitable to a lot of plants or a lot of farming, but that area, even to this day, is known for a very unique flavor in its honey, and is very marketable within the East, or what we would consider the Southeast. And so they got to talking to these people, and just the things that these men knew about these bees. It's different concepts today, but it's the same root knowledge that you have to have. And I love that. I love that, here we are 100 years, 50 years, 30 years later in some instances, and we've had these huge changes in technology, but just the heart of the matter has stayed the same. Another book that kind of came to me by chance was called Honey Plants, and it was written by a man named Frank C. Paulette. And Frank was someone that had grown up in the Midwest. He settled down in the 1910s, 1920s to practice law in Missouri. And he decided, law was not his calling, and he would be much happier if he could be outside. And he could be much happier if he was doing the things that he was passionate about. And that was agriculture and native plants and bees. During the course of his life, he wrote 16 books and was considered the father of pollination and wildflower conservation between the 1920s to the 1950s. So here we are again, 100 years ago, 70 years ago, and the same type of things keep coming up. And so one of his books was about our backyard neighbors. It focused on not only like cultivating plants and cultivating bees, but doing it in a way that balanced the native plants that were already there and taking into consideration the native bees that were also there. Flowers of the Wild, Their Culture and Requirements, and then The History of American Beekeeping. I've heard that these are all very fascinating books if you can get past some of the terminology. So if you're interested in more of the technical things, or more of a traditional style of beekeeping, what that entails, or even just native pollinators in general, you're looking for something to compare it to, these are some fun books for you. A lot of them have been digitized and can be found like on Amazon or other like digital reading platforms. Okay, so who are pollinators? When we keep talking about pollinators, I've talked quite a bit about bees in particular. And so we're going to look at, what is a pollinator? Who are these creatures? Our most common answer that I get when I ask kids or when I have a program is that they're honeybees. And that's because that's what we think about. The bees need the pollen, they need the nectar, they're going to make honey. And so that seems to be the process that everybody's mind goes through. They're visible, they make a sound. Some of us concerned about being stung, whether it's because of an allergy or a bad past experience. I've never been stung personally, but I have a cousin that for reasons unknown to me, it's like they're drawn to him. And so he must put off some kind of smell or something that makes them curious about him. And he is now allergic to bee and wasp stings. So it's good to be observant, but also know your limits and what you might need. All right, so when we look at the honeybee, we look at, there's all these different parts to it. It's got its antennas that are for feeling and smelling. It's got its eye, which is a compound eye. We have basically like one large lens. Insects have all these different lenses. And so that allows them to see a very different perspective than we do. If you look at like National Geographic or other Animal Planet type shows that give you a filter of how bees see, it'll make you dizzy pretty quick. If we look at their tongue, at their mouthpiece is called a mandible. They don't really have a mandible like other insects that's used for like crunching and munching. It's not so much used for teeth as it is just to cover up their proboscis in the insides of their mouth when they're not using that proboscis, which is the straw-like tube. It's a hollow tube that goes down into the nectar bearing part of the plant and draws that out. They have what's called a honey stomach, which is what is going to temporarily store that nectar, because they are not going to digest a whole lot of nectar in its raw form. They want to spit it back out, basically, have it set in a comb. So we think of our honeycombs, and as it ages and as they work it with pollen and more nectar and whatever else the case may be, because we know that other particles are just going to be in the air, whatnot, that is what they're going to use as a food source. They have their pollen baskets, which they use to store pollen. They have these great, I would consider them like a guard hair or, some kind of large fuzzy hair that can kind of stick to, and it helps get it then helps them get that pollen to that pollen basket. They do have a stinger, so we want to be watchful of that. They, above their stinger, actually have a wax gland, and that's how, if you're ever curious of how they make the honeycomb, that's what they have to use. They have wings, that's how they fly. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. That's the three parts of any insect. And they also have glands, which we would consider like at the base of their neck, which is where they're going to produce royal jelly, which is a substance that helps with like feeding the queen, the larva, those that stay in the hive. Okay, our solitary bee species. When people got to watching honeybees, and then they got to looking at native bees, they noticed that there were some differences. And so there were all sorts of bee species already here in North America when people landed and went west and started farming and whatnot. And people that were curious started learning more about them. And so they have the same basic parts, the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. But our bumblebees are going to be a little bit more shaggy. They're going to have a little bit more broad stripe than, say, the honeybee, that's going to have a tight pattern, especially on the abdomen before you get to the stinger. Your bumblebees might have a dot on their back. They might have a black, yellow, black pattern or a yellow, black, yellow pattern. There's so many different species, and it is so hard when you're first trying to identify them to figure out what's what. It comes with a lot of practice and a lot of patience and some really good insect guidebooks. There's also the Carpenter Bee. And so your Carpenter Bee, their mandibles, those mouthpiece, that's what they're going to use to dig into wood. And that's why when we hear that noise and we look up, we often see this shiny black bee bottom. We don't see the head poke out, we see, something else. And over time, if we sit there long enough, we'll hopefully see more than just sawdust in that hole. All right, leafcutter bees, that's another native species of bees. And unlike your honeybees that are going to create a hive, or your carpenter bees, which are going to drill a home into a piece of wood or into a stem, depending on where they're at, your leafcutter bees are going to use their mandibles, which are like an offset saw, to cut sections of leaf off, and they will take it kind of like a paper wasp nest, and they will form their home using those leaves and their spit, or maybe depending on if they're in an arid area, they might use a little bit of like mud or something to help camouflage it and to give it a more uniform kind of a look to it. They will use their proboscis to get nectar off of the plants. You can see there is yellow on parts of this insect's body. So as they're going from plant to plant, they're pollinating not because that's their main job is to get that pollen and that nectar, but because their body is just designed to carry small particles. And so that pollen is going to be moving with them. They're also going to be, depending on the plant, Some leafcutter bees and other solitary bees, they will use their mandibles to cut underneath the blossom of that flower, and they will drain the nectar that way. They don't go into it. They kind of cheat and pull the nectar out of it. So that's something interesting to see also. All right, hummingbirds. When we think of hummingbirds, we know that they drink nectar, and we know that they're attracted to red things. Your insects don't see red on the same plane that like birds do, or we do. Insects see on an infrared scale. So things look a little bit different. Like what's white to us has more of a bluish purple tinge. What's orange to them is going to have more of a red tinge. You know, things are going to be a little bit offset. But hummingbirds, they're drawn to those bright red blossoms. Because they can hover, a lot of times they don't make direct contact with that plant. So unlike our bees that kind of buzz and vibrate these blooms, your hummingbirds aren't going to do that. But because of the wind that comes off their wings, because sometimes they do have to land, and then because they have such tight feathers, pollen does move, and it's going to move with them. So they're kind of a pollinator by default. All right, butterflies. We think about the monarch butterfly has been the poster child for the pollinator and the insect conservation movement for several years now. And ironically, butterflies are not going to be your most common or your most helpful pollinators. But I love this picture because what it is showing us, and we know this, we just don't think about it too hard, is that no plant, like if we were to line up all the plants in the world, you know, they would all bloom a certain way. They would all point a certain direction. Some of them follow the sun. Some of them don't bloom until it's dark. Some of them bloom upright. Some of them bloom sideways. Some of them bloom down. And so here we see this great picture of a butterfly sipping nectar in a lily that is growing downwards. And so we think about, you know, how they can maneuver and how they can get into those spaces. And that's going to help these plants in the long run. The Diana fritillary is our state butterfly here in Arkansas. It was named after Diana, the goddess. So we think about, you know, Wonder Woman and stuff like that. The lady that discovered this butterfly, she wanted the butterfly to be named after a powerful woman. Fritillary is just the type of butterfly, the family that it falls into. So we see these all over the state. They're more common in certain areas than not. And we'll talk a little bit later about how to find out kind of what's in your area. Blister beetles. So beetles are, ironically, the most common type of insect. If we were to create a pie chart of all the insects in the world and of which ones were beetles, beetles would be the majority by far. And they're one of those pollinators, whether it's a blister beetle, whether it's, you know, like a rhinoceros beetle, whether it's, you know, just whatever beetle pops into your head. They're what is known as like a messy pollinator because they just scurry around from bloom to bloom, and they're often looking for other things. They still need nectar as an energy source. They might use pollen as a total package because pollen is basically like carbs and sugars and, you know, proteins all rolled into one little sticky ball. And so they need that for different times of the year. But they also are looking for other smaller insects. They're looking for maybe a drop of water that's on that plant. And so as they scurry around, that's how they're moving that pollen. Okay, the ladybird beetle, what we call the ladybug. They are often on plants because they are looking for aphids. If you have an aphid problem on your houseplants, if you have an aphid problem in your garden, sometimes you can actually buy ladybugs and release them as an organic form of pest control. Again, as they're scurrying around, they have very prickly looking spiky hairs on their legs, and that's going to catch things. So as they scurry around, they're moving pollen from place to place. Low flies. We often don't look at blowflies with much compassion or see them as something that has purpose. But again, we've got these blossoms and we've got these blooms that maybe a butterfly is too big to fit into, or maybe the smell and the quality of the nectar does not attract a bee. Each flower is going to attract something that is specific to its needs. Some flowers are more equal opportunity, like nectar, pollen givers. Others are more specific because to get that pollen where they need it, they need something of a specific size. And so blowflies are one of those things that can get down into parts of plants. Some of our larger pollinators cannot. And then we have our smallest of all, the midge. We look at flies, we look at mosquitoes. Fun fact, female mosquitoes are the ones that bite you in the summertime. They're the ones looking for blood because they are the ones that are needing that protein found in blood to create the egg sac and have something for the mosquito larva to feed off of. So the males actually though, a lot of wetland plants are pollinated by male mosquitoes. Your midge is the smallest. Those are those little gnat-like things that sometimes fly in your eyes, get up your nose. We commonly confuse them with gnats, but midges are actually one of the things that pollinate chocolate. So not the type that we have here in Arkansas, but one that's specific to cocoa plants is what does all that magic. Communal wasps. When we look at wasps, again, sometimes it's not something that we look on with a lot of compassion or with a lot of like, oh yeah, those are great things type of attitude. But wasps, again, they're going to be using that pollen, they're going to be using that nectar. They're trying to build hives, they're trying to feed their young. And so they're moving a lot of pollen also for these plants. Wasp, if you wanted to look at it, they're very much like bees. They're in the same family as bees. They're like cousins. And it would, bee would actually look a lot like a wasp if it didn't have all that fuzz. So the next time we go to swat wasps, we might want to give it a second thought. All right, orioles. A lot of times we don't think of something with feathers or something that large as being a pollinator. But orioles, especially orchard orioles, because they are after fruit, because they are found in areas where there are blooms, not on the ground, like a flower, not in a shrub, like a flowering plant, but up in a tree, they are helping to pollinate that level of things. And they're doing it by going from bloom to bloom, checking, there's different smells that they're attracted to, there's different fruits that they're attracted to. It's something that we see more in the Southeast than we do here in Arkansas, but I felt like it was worth mentioning just because it's something that's different and that we don't often think about. We also have nighttime pollinators. Not every plant has adapted to being out in the full heat of the sun. Some of them wait until later in the evening to perk up. Some of them might not release their nectar or their pollen until the sun has gone down. And that's where moths come into play because they're more active in the evening than, say, a butterfly. They're larger, they're more fuzzy. They don't have to have the heat of the sun or the heat of the day to help them move as easily as butterflies do. So our moths are going to be something that is going to come out at night and go from plant to plant. They have fascinating names, a lot of them from Greek mythology. Sphinx moths we see quite a bit, especially downtown, because we have a lot of oak trees, and oak trees are one of their host homes. Their larvae, their caterpillars, enjoy the oak leaves, and then they use the oak bark to blend in with. All right, cutworms. If you have ever tried to grow a garden, if you have ever talked very long with a farmer, cutworms will come up, and they are usually given the worst adjectives that you can give to an insect. Okay, cutworms will cut down your plants. They will eat anything that's green. They have voracious appetites. They're kind of slimy. They're not very pretty. But ironically, the dingy cutworm moth, which is one of the most common pollinators in certain areas, that's going to be one that if you can let it grow to its full potential, it actually does a lot of good for plants, native and like agriculturally. It's just letting it get to that point and keeping it off the plants we don't want it to eat. That is the unique challenge. So that's something that, if you want to look more into it, definitely interesting, because all my life I just heard that cutworms were terrible. And I had never thought to look at the other side of things or look to see, what they actually look like when they're an adult. Okay, wasp moths. Again, wasps are kin to bees and other insects. They look a lot like a bee if it didn't have all the fuzz. And the wasp moth, which is a clear wing moth usually, it is going to be something that is going to need a lot of pollen and a lot of nectar throughout its life cycle. So it is going to be very prevalent along certain species of plants. Okay, so what is pollen? That's what these pollinators are after. And pollen, when we think about it here in the South, there's a certain season where everybody gets allergies. Everybody knows that it's going to coat your cars. If it rains, you're going to have these yellow rivers of pollen going down your sidewalks. It's just something that we've all learned to live with. But pollen are those little yellow balls or pieces that are set on top of the purple clone flower on the left. And then on the right, they're down in the bottom of that lily. They're going to be in different areas. And the whole point behind pollen is that as it moves from plant to plant, it tells that plant to go, to bloom, to grow, to produce fruit, whatever the case may be. It's like that green signal for it to start doing whatever it is it needs to do. And if we didn't have that pollinator moving that pollen from plant to plant, we would have to do it ourselves. And it's not easy. And just by letting native animals or honeybees move pollen for you, that's $1 billion industry. So they do a lot of good for us. Pollen to the naked eye, if you have a beekeeper, there's somebody that collects pollen, the granules are going to look something like this. People use it a lot for allergy relief. You can put it in smoothies. You can take a tablespoon of it in your cereal, just however you can get it down. Some people try to do it in the raw. I don't know how they do it because it is kind of sticky. Like it'll just coat your tongue and the inside of your mouth, and then you're left there wanting a drink of something just to wash it down. When we look at it under a microscope, we see something that the kids tell me looks kind of like the coronavirus, that others say, just looks like a terrible spiky ball. It has a lot of points to it. That's how it's so, not easily, but how those small insects are able to gather it so adeptly. It just clings to things. That's also why it makes us sneeze, because it's trying to cling to the inside of our nose and our throat and anything that has mucus on the inside of us. So we know that it does a lot of good, but we also know that it can cause some of us a little bit of a discomfort. All right, we start to look at the things that produce pollen, and we start to look at some native plants. And the big question becomes, what's in the name? And I love it because I think of like Anne of Green Gables, and I think of the movie where somebody's talking about names, and she goes, well, they say a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but I don't think that I would enjoy a rose as much if it were something like a thistle or a skunk cabbage. And so we're gonna look at some of the fun plants that are at the Native Plant Garden at the Central Arkansas Nature Center. So where Morgan and I work, there is a native plant garden that has over 186 current individual plants of over, I think it's 95 or 96 species now. They're not native all to Central Arkansas, but from all over the state. And some of them have some very fascinating names. The foxglove beard tongue is one that they think looks like you know, a dragon's tongue or a mouth that has just opened up. And it's amazing to see insects buzz in and out of these plants. We also have the purple beer tongue, which is a variation. And then we have our sundrops, which get their name because they look like, you know, just some little yellow piece of the sun has fallen and landed out in a field. These guys are very colorful. They need a little bit of help along the way, but they're very gorgeous and they're a great summer bloom. The asters, the fragrant asters, are something that we tell people to consider because they're hardy, they're easy to grow, and they're something that is a fall blooming plant. When you plant for insects or when you plant for pollinators in particular, you need to think about they need something in the spring, they need something in the summer, and they need something in the fall. They have either hibernated or they have like laid eggs or they're caterpillars and then they have died by the time it gets cold. But the asters are something that's that last big energy boost in the fall to let them do what they need to do. Bee balm or a bergamot plant, that's something that has unique color and texture. It has a decent smell to it. Not all of our native pollinator plants have great smells. Some of them are musky. Some of them are almost sour. Some of them are sweet. It just depends on the plant itself and what it's trying to attract. But the bee balm is something that is going to attract not only bees, but a lot of other insects as well. And so it's a very good multi-purpose plant, and we see it mid to late summer. Our rough blazing star is a true, what they would consider prairie plant. It needs an area where the roots can grow deep. You might not see it bloom the first year that you plant it. You might want to be patient, but once it does bloom, it has just amazing color and texture and almost otherworldly blooms with that kind of fuzzy tentacle-like blossoms. The Virginia Sweet Spire, that is one of my favorites. It's found not only at our native plant garden, but other areas downtown like Curran Hall. There used to be some, I think, between Heifer and the Democrat Gazette. There's all sorts of places where you can find it. It can grow in shade or partial sun. It's a very adaptable plant. You just need to make sure it stays, you know, watered throughout the summer when it gets really hot. And its blooms are a lot like a drive-through for insects. There's plenty of blossoms. There's plenty of ways for them to get the nectar and the pollen that they need. The Indian pink, this is another one that is kind of a prairie plant. We don't see it commonly here in central Arkansas, but the yellow blossoms and then the red kind of casings that come up under those blossoms, they attract your hummingbirds and your butterflies and other insects alike. So that's a really fun plant to see and just fantastic color. All right, so what's the big deal? We've heard the stories of some of these people that have cared about pollinators. We know that a lot of people over the history of the US have moved them from the original 13 colonies westward, specifically the honeybee. They've moved it quite a bit. So what's the big deal? Well, for me, the big deal is that we have so many iconic places here in Arkansas. This is Hawksbill Crag. It's one of the most photographed areas here in the state. If you think of like Garvin Gardens and all the plants that are there, they might not be native, but they still need pollinators. We think about the blue bonnets in Texas. We think about all these different places. And if we didn't have pollinators, we wouldn't have those spaces. Those flowers wouldn't get all that they needed unless the wind was, you know, blowing a certain way all the time. And so over time, we would lose these unique spaces. Not only are they natural, they're considered cultural sites also because of the ways they've drawn humans, of the ways that our stories connect with them. We think of art. We think of how pollinators have played a role in past things. There's a whole musical composition called The Flight of the Bumblebee. You know, if we didn't have pollinators, we wouldn't have this inspiration for some of our former artists. We think about food. We think about gardening. This is the historic garden at the Fort Smith National Historic Site. So you think about the people that when Arkansas was considered the Wild West, they needed food. Today, we still need food. 1 out of every 3 bites that we eat comes from something that has been pollinated. If we did not have pollinators, we could still survive, but we would be severely vitamin deficient. So you think about a lot of our greens, a lot of our nuts, our fruits. That is something that pollinators help us with. I tell the kids all the time that if you didn't have pollinators, you could not have pizza, because you think about the grains that we have. A lot of them are pollinated by wind. Some of them are better pollinated by pollinators. Tomatoes specifically have to have a bee to pollinate them. Cheese, again, if we don't have good grains, we don't have cows eating them, we don't have milk, we can't make cheese. And then our toppings, because those things are also fed a lot of grain. Flood control. When you have healthy plants, those healthy plants are holding the soil. And the more firm your soil is, the better that your plant growth is, the less bare spots that you have, the less erosion you're hopefully going to have. On the flip side of that, did y'all know that the Sahara Desert is growing? It's growing at this very interesting rate. And if you look at a time-lapse map of how it has grown in the last 40, 50 years, it's kind of scary. And part of that is because that area in Africa, they're not practicing sustainable farming. They're not practicing planting things that maybe need less water or need, they're trying to plant things that need more space. And so by clearing out these other plants, they're actually creating this really crazy imbalance. Definitely something to look at, especially like National Geographic. It's really cool. But here's the important part. You can help. There's a lot that we can do here, especially in Arkansas, in our region, in our nation, that will help pollinators in the long run. One of the things is to plant natives. In my yard, I haven't tried it yet. Where I lived, it took me a while to figure out what was actually coming up when, because the people that sold us the house, they planted these really interesting plants that just bloom for 1 week out of the year, right before they left, trying to increase the home value, which is not bad. It's just, it makes it hard on me because I don't want to just start digging and then dig up a useful plant or, whatever the case may be. But if you plant natives, they're hardy. They don't need fertilizing. They don't need as much water. They oftentimes will grow in bunches, and there's some that will spread out. So you got to be mindful of that, of what kind of ground cover you're looking at or wanting. But they're going to be helping those native pollinators, and those native insects in turn are going to be the basis of our food chain for a lot of birds, small mammals, larger mammals, depending on how large the insect is. And so it's not just about what's on the ground, it's about what's happening all around it. All right, think globally and act locally. This bat is the Mexican long-tongued bat. And you can see from its snout, it has a very nice rounded pointy snout. And then when we look at its tongue, it does have a very long tongue. We can see that its face is covered in pollen. And the plant that it pollinates exclusively is the agave plant. This might not sound like a big deal, but some people, agave is their, natural sugar substitute of choice. For other people, they just really enjoy tequila. I'm not one of those people, but I feel like, it's still relevant. And if we aren't concerned about what we're consuming comes from, there's the chance that it's going to go away. And so it's kind of back to that whole thing of the Lorax. Unless someone like you cares an awful lot, it's not going to get better. It's just not. The long-tongued bat is in danger of habitat loss because it uses the agave as its food source, but it doesn't use the agave plants as its roosting area. And where they roost is actually being taken over by farmers that have successfully learned how to mass produce these agave plants. So people like Bat Conservation International are trying to help educate them on like, hey, this is what a balance looks like, and this is what different things look like, and this is why you need to have both to succeed. You can't just exponentially increase your crop and not have something to help pollinate it, or it's going to cost you a whole lot more in the long run. This is the cocoa midge, or cacao midge, and it is the only thing that will pollinate the chocolate plant. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I do enjoy chocolate, and I would be very sad if chocolate went away. A couple of years ago, there was this whole thing about a chocolate shortage, and the price of like a Hershey's candy bar skyrocketed and all this stuff. And when we went to Plan Museum, I was like, okay, we're not buying chocolate, we're buying all the other stuff, because I want to save the chocolate for people that actually like love it, which sounds terribly selfish, but you know, again, if something's in a shortage, you got to conserve what you have. All right, another way that you can help out is by being what they call a citizen scientist. There are people all over the world that have all sorts of questions about pollinators and about reptiles and all sorts of crazy stuff. And because people can't be everywhere at once, and because we have such a boom in technology all over the world, it is easier now to use your cell phone or your computer to help with some of these things. So like the Herp Mapper is a real-time map where you can upload pictures of different reptiles and amphibians that you see. iNaturalist has been used by state parks, by national parks, and is now used by Game and Fish to help map out where you see certain species of animals and plants. Journey North is focused on not only monarch butterflies journeying up from Mexico, but other insects now. They've partnered with a few websites to kind of become one bigger group. Project NOAA is endangered species. Your computer-friendly programs is eBird, FrogWatch, Firefly Watch. Feeder Watch is part of like Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Feeder Watch. The Lost Ladybug Project. There were a lot of areas where ladybugs were very common, and now they just don't see them. And so they're trying to answer the question, is this a food shortage? Is this a chemical problem? Is this a loss of habitat? You know, what is going on with these bugs? Bamona, I mentioned earlier, there's a great website that you can see what kind of butterflies or moths are in your area. And that's where Bamona comes in, because it is all the butterflies and moths of North America. You go in and you can see by state, you can see by county, or you can see by zip code of what is in your area. And if you really get into native plant gardening, you'll have host plants for different butterflies and moths. And so this will give you a good starting point of what host plants you need for those insects. The Great Sunflower Project, that is, the focus is how large plants grow over time and how they are affected by climate change. So that's kind of a twofold project there, and sunflowers are the base for how they grow and what kind of window and all that. All right, ways to get involved. A lot of people, like I mentioned before, when they see the monarch butterfly, they're like, oh yes, that's the poster child for pollinators. And they really don't do a huge amount of work just pollinating from plant to plant, but they journey so far. There's a lot of people that are cheering them on. And so it's just good to be in the know. It's good to be informed. The Western population of monarch butterflies took a huge hit during all the California wildfires. The Eastern population is pretty steady, but even if the Eastern population increases, that will not offset the damage done to the Western population. And so they are trying to figure out, you know, what will be the best combination of things to help this insects stay stable. And the more that you help this insect, it's not just helping them, but it's helping, like I mentioned earlier, that whole bottom of the food chain, those insects and those plants that are hosts for those insects. It's helping the birds and small mammals that eat them. And so not only have we found a good way to help the monarchs, but a lot of the same host plants that monarchs use to get nectar are good habitat for like quail and ground nesting birds. These birds can use the seeds from some of these plants. They can use, the height of some of these plants as a way to get through them more easily than like dense grass that just is like a wall trying to get through. A lot of people got really excited because this year the monarch butterfly is featured on the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission license plate. A lot of people have the misconception that if they buy the monarch license plate, that they are supporting monarch habitat that way. That is not the case. Anytime that you buy a license plate, the excess money from that plate is going to fund scholarships for the next set of biologists, conservation techs, educators, enforcement officers, canine officers, whatever conservation field these kids go into. So you are helping, you're making an impact, you're actually impacting the future now because you're allowing those kids the scholarship money to finish up their 4 years of college, to get those degrees, and to get boots on the ground that we desperately need. The best way that people can help here in Arkansas is to buy a hunting or a fishing license. Our 1 year to date fishing license, so that would be like if you bought one today, you would not have to buy another one till this date in 2022. It is $10.50. We are the second lowest license for fishing in the state or in the United States. Alabama is the only one that is lower than us. And so that's kind of impressive. But it also, sometimes I'm like, oh man, we should be the lowest. So it's a toss up, but we do a lot with the little that we have. Your money that goes into those hunting and fishing license, it's not just going back into those game species. It's going to species that aren't hunted or aren't fished. It's going into all of it. And that money is also matched through federal grants. So, we can't change the size of Arkansas. A lot of people tell me they don't want to change the population density of Arkansas, but we can definitely change how many licenses are sold and then matched through federal dollars. So I encourage y'all to do that or to ask questions about that because the more you know, the better it is. Okay. The future is what we make it. There's a whole lot out there that we can do. There's a whole lot of positive impacts. There's a whole lot of I don't want to say negative, but there's a whole lot of things that, we can stop doing that are also going to have a positive impact. We talk about reduce, reuse, recycle. If we're reducing, that means that we're not consuming as much energy. That means that we're not having to build more solar farms. That means that we're not having to build more wind farms. That means that we're not creating, changing these spaces that before were prime habitat. And so I want y'all to think about the impacts that you're making and how we can, as my grandmother used to say, make your corner of the world a little bit better place. So thank y'all for joining us tonight. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I hope that you learned a few things. I hope that you leave with more questions. The beauty of partnering with a library is that, libraries have so many amazing resources and they have so many books. So if you have a question about anything that I've, shared tonight, that would be a great place to start, is to start researching and, find out what's the latest, greatest thing about some of these pollinators or about their story. Okay. I also want to remind y'all that this is part of an ongoing series. Like Morgan mentioned at the beginning of the program, our next program is going to be Morgan presenting on tracks and signs. It is going to be, the same time, 6:30 p.m., same place, the Central Arkansas Library System, and it is going to be on July 12th. So mark your calendars then, because that is a lot of fun, learning about the tracks and signs and things that are in your backyard. All right, Questions? Morgan, did we have anything?
Yes, we did, and there's a couple of them I didn't know how to answer. Mark asked, is there a particular pollinator that is more important than others?
Okay. That's a really good question, and that's a really hard question because you got to think about the grand scheme of things. You got to think about people's preferences. A lot of our food that is commercially produced is going to be pollinated by honeybees. So almonds, avocados, fruits, things of that nature, it's going to be honeybees that are actually moved from place to place to hit that season. When I was a kid, I used to see like harvesters move from place to place. Well, now they're moving bees place to place. And if you ever see a bee truck go down the road, it is the most unbelievable thing because there's just nets covering it and there's like bees just swarming the whole vehicle, and occasionally like one will fly out the back, and I mean it's just unbelievable. Our native bees are important and our other native insects because they're keeping that process going that's been there for thousands of years. And so we want those plants to be there. We want those animals to be thriving because that's what our habitats are going to be thriving with. And if our areas around us aren't thriving, we can't either. So there's a lot. I mean, it's just, you don't ever want to say like one's more important than the other. You just got to think of like what you're trying to accomplish or what the goal is, and then how they play into that and what you might need to help them or take away to let them succeed. Good question.
Another question was, what kind of help do sundrops need?
What kind of help do the sundrops need? Because they are a low bushy plant, you want to make sure that they are in an area to where, like if there's a heavy rain or if there is a like sudden change in weather, that they're protected. So you might want to put them in an area where there's a little bit more shade, or like what we would consider like a canopy. So there's layers to the plants there. That way they get a little bit more indirect, or they get a little bit more of a lessened blow, whether it's from the wind, the rain, or direct sunlight. If you look at, I mean, if you buy them at a native plant garden or at Lowe's, they'll have a little, stick that shows where to put them and all that good stuff. So they don't really need a whole lot of fertilizer or anything. It's just making sure that they don't get beat up before they really get rooted and going. So kind of baby them at first and then let them go.
Okay, Debbie, I put in there they need some sun too, so it's just a little mixture of it.
Yep.
Some more questions. How do they register for the tracks class, and do Game and Fish have any jobs or opportunities for beekeepers?
For beekeepers. So we actually do not, because the beekeeping is more of a non-native thing. But if you get in with the USDA, or if you get in with the U of A through like the agri-science department, they have a lot of classes and great resources for bees. In our area, the go-to guy is named John Zavislak. And not only is he a beekeeper, he and his wife, they use the honey and the honeycomb and all that for all sorts of unique things. So definitely reach out to him. You can Google, Arkansas Extension, John Zavislak, and by the time you get to John Z, it should fill in the rest of it because his last name is very hard to spell. I'm not going to even attempt that. But yeah, they're going to be your main source, is U of A or USDA.